Let's rock and roll. My name is Lawrence Rosenberg, and this is the Alpha Human Podcast. My guest today is Varg Freeborn. Varg is a world-renowned self-defense and gunfight instructor, as well as a lethal force educator and fitness coach. Varg is also the author of the book, Violence of Mind, Training and Preparation for Extreme Violence. Varg's insight into the topic of violence, preparing for it, understanding it, and defending against it is informed by having been immersed in violent crime for half of his life. Varg grew up in a household where members of his immediate family were murdered or sent to prison. 17 years ago, at age 19, Varg was convicted in a self-defense case gone horribly wrong for stabbing his attacker dozens of times, and he was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison. After Varg's release, he went on to become an expert in close quarters combat, gunfighting, breaching, close protection, boxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and today he provides professional training to civilians, law enforcement, and organizations such as the Ohio Tactical Officers Association and the Alliance Ohio Police Training Facility. Varg's experience with criminal violence, concealment as fieldcraft, close fighting, especially with weapons, and criminal mindset are unsurpassed in the self-defense industry in the area of civilian criminal violence education. Varg, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Varg. I'll tell you what, I'm heavily impacted by having read your book. Your book, Violence of Mind, is an eye-opener. It is an eye-opener into the real world and what lurks within that world that most of us are so far removed from that it's almost the stuff of films that we just don't know is real. And if we were faced with it, I am certain that without your insight, without your education, that many of us would fall victim to the predators that are out there everywhere, but just for many of us out of reach until the moment it's too late. Your book is a tremendous work that I highly recommend anyone, and I mean anyone, read. So first, I wanted to say that, and I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on this show.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for having me on too.
You know, I want to set the scene for everybody so they kind of know, so they have some context and they understand your background. So I'm going to quote you from the book here. I endured more beatings before age 10 than most of you would ever receive in a lifetime. I've put dozens of holes in other men and have had a few put into me. My family was involved heavily in the illicit drug business, and I promise you this was the shit that they make movies about. It's amazing I survived all the fights, the weapons, the stabbings, the shootings, the bar fights, the car wrecks, the drugs, the drug deals, and the alcohol. I never set foot inside of a high school. I never went to a prom, never attended a high school ball game. I was raised by wolves, and a quite nasty pack of them at that. I was a young wolf. By 18, I had seen more death, cracked more heads, and spilled more blood than most average professionals will do in their entire careers. Varg, can you tell us about your journey as a child, growing up the way you did, and how it led to being sentenced to prison for defending your life?
Yeah, sure. And first, I'd like to say that the way that passage in the book comes off, I want to say right up front that nothing that I said in the book and nothing that I will say now is bragging, because I would be remiss to brag about such a tragic experience in such a tragic young life. So in no way am I bragging about things. I am just literally, when I was writing the book, I was just literally trying to convey, the scope of what it really was that I was experiencing and people like me were experiencing in that era and at that time. And so what that amounted to was I grew up, I was born to a single teenage mom. She was 16 when she had me. Her mother had died when she was 4, so she didn't even have a mother. And my grandfather was a steel mill worker. He had 8 or 9 kids and he worked all the time. So they were home alone. This was the 70s. And
Hmm.
so drugs and, everything was really out of control at that time too. And they just basically, were out of control. They were members of my family were motorcycle club members. There were, gang members. There was several ex-convicts. They were all drug addicts or alcoholics, and half of them were drug dealers. My family was both sides of my family were involved in heavy, moving heavy amounts of drugs. So they were moving quite a bit of weight, and it was a very violent atmosphere, right? It was a very my family was very violent. They were violent with each other, and they were violent with other people. And so I was very acquainted with violence early, and also having to read people to determine if you might be in danger in a room or not, right? Because you don't know from day to day if somebody's like high on some drug and they turn into a monster, which happened frequently. The person that loved you and like played with you the day before might be the one that tries to like snap your neck the next day because they're out of their minds. So
Mm.
you always had to read every situation and everything very very clearly and very detailed ways. And so that awareness was grown very early for me. And that's very pivotal to how, I developed my concepts about orientation and what's going into my second book, which we'll talk about later. But
Hmm.
so that basically was how I grew up. And and through my teenage years on the streets and stuff like that, like it just never, I was never a person that like victimized innocent people, right? So I wouldn't call myself like a criminal in the traditional sense of what people would think a criminal is, or a violent criminal, right?
Okay.
I wasn't out like knocking old ladies out or robbing people or things like that. But if you approached me in a violent way, or we were involved in some type of transaction that went bad, then I would get extremely violent at that point. Um, and so there was several times that you know really bad things had happened, and I had some family members killed, and some of my friends growing up were murdered and things like that. um and then eventually I got into an altercation with 3 guys. It was an altercation that started with one of them over a period of about 6 months, and I really honestly tried to avoid this confrontation as much as possible. And I had told this guy several times to leave me alone, and he didn't heed those warnings. And he showed up one night at a party with 2 of his friends, and he was extremely drunk and high and just out of his mind. And he tried to coax me into leaving with him, because how
Hmm.
drunk people sometimes think they're making sense,
Right.
but they're not
Right.
making sense, right?
Yeah.
And so he obviously thought what he was saying was completely reasonable to believe, and it was not at all reasonable to believe, because we were mortal enemies, and
Right.
there's no reason I'd be leaving with you at 2 in the morning, right? And you're
Right.
buddies. And so that was going on. When he realized that wasn't going to work, he just became very escalated and very angry. And I was trapped. This was the 90s, the early 90s. There was no cell phones. I didn't have a car at the time with me, and there was I don't even think the house had a landline phone in it. Like you were
Wow.
literally on an island, right? Like, people today don't understand what it was like if you were running around back then.
Hmm.
Like if you were stuck somewhere, like you were stuck.
You were stuck. Yeah, for
It
sure.
was, there was no like you know something in your pocket to bail you out. So I was stuck at this address, and um, he was becoming escalated and telling me he was gonna kill me and stuff. And he's like, my family's in the mafia. I'm gonna kill you, and this and that. And I'm like, look, man, you need to leave me alone. Like, you need to leave me alone. So at this point, I'm witness coaching, which we fully understood back then, right? Like, so you begin to witness coach, like, and you're trying to lay the groundwork because something's going to happen, and you want people, you're creating a narrative for the
Okay.
witnesses to follow, right?
Okay.
And I blew that. That didn't work anyway because I blew it later. But at that point, I'm witness coaching, so I'm saying very loudly, "Hey, leave me alone. Don't come near me." Because when I, you know, when we engage in combat here, I don't want people thinking that I just jumped on you for no reason, right? Because I'm trying to get you to stay away from me, and that's really ultimately what I want is for you to stay away from me.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, I just did not want to go to battle with this guy. We had fought one time before. He was 100 pounds bigger than me. I was at the time like out of shape, not really. There were times in my life where I trained, and that wasn't one of them, unfortunately. And so he basically got me cornered, and the way that I perceived it going down was like this: his two friends disappeared, and then I noticed that they had backed the car up to the back door of the house. Now he was pushing me, you know, with pressure through the house to the back of the house, and I kind of was putting together what's going on here is that
Right.
they want me in that car regardless of how this goes down. And this was a time when one of my best friends, a kid named Pat, had ended up. They found him floating in a lake, a local lake, with a couple bullet holes in his head, right? And nobody ever knew who did it. That he just came up dead one day, and it was tragic because the guy was like the most nonviolent, likable, cool guy you could ever know. Um, and so my point is that when someone when some drunk and high people at 2 in the morning are saying they want to put you in a car and they're gonna kill you, you you take it serious because your uncle, like my uncle,
Mm-hmm.
was beaten on his couch, taken out into an orchard and shot to death, right? A best friend of mine shows up in a lake with holes in his head. So this isn't something that you're going to say to me and I'm going to be like blowing it off, right? Because I'm taking it
Right.
very serious at this time. And so, and it was like we're at 93, 94. Youngstown, Ohio was per capita murder capital, right? Like it was extremely violent at those times, right? So that was when this was happening, 1993,
Okay.
1993, 94. And so for context, it's a violent time. There's violent things going on. Personally people have been killed and things like that. And so when somebody says that, all right, now we're in a very serious conflict. So now I'm calculating that we're going to take this to a very serious level here now. So I yell a couple last times to the guy, don't don't touch me, don't come after me. And I back up into the last room. That's when I look out to see the car. And I just realize I'm like, all right, I'm stuck here, and there's three dudes, right? And two of them are outside, but they could be inside it very quickly. And
Right.
so I yelled to him one more time. He came in the room. I said, "Don't touch me." And he came after me and he pinned me against the wall by my throat. And that's when I drew my knife out and I began to stab him.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to work on his. I started in his chest, and I worked my way up his left chest into his left neck, and then he went to a full clinch with me. And when he went to a full clinch, I was reaching over his back and stabbing him in his back. And then we worked we worked that clinch for quite a while. I'm not sure how long it was. These things seem like they take longer, but it's seconds. And it seemed like it went on for quite a while. But he starts to try to spin me off of the wall, and when he does, he kind of goes lower, and then work up off of his back into then the right side of his neck. So
Mm-hmm.
now I've stabbed him in both sides of his neck and in his chest and across his back. And so eventually he reaches the quit, and the life just starts to go out of him, and he goes limp and he falls backwards. And when he fell backwards, he's bleeding out of like 2 dozen holes, and I'm completely soaked from my chest all the way to my boots. I'm completely soaked in blood. Like like I jumped in a pool of blood. It was that much blood.
Mm.
And and he fell backwards, and he looked up at me and he gurgled and he said I'm sorry. And apparently I was so, in such an anger state at that time that I looked down and I said, die, MFer, you know, and of all the times, of all the hundreds of times that I said, uh, quite literally dozens of times that I said, leave me alone, don't come near me. What do you think the witnesses remembered in court?
That.
Yeah, they
Okay.
remember me saying that. Yeah. So
Of course.
that was a big mistake, right? Like that was, but I was caught up in the heat of the moment, and this guy had put me in a position where I had to, what I thought is, kill him. And I was very angry about the whole thing, so I was very angry with him that you're gonna say you're sorry after we went to this level, when you could have just easily walked away from me and I wouldn't have bothered you. you know
Right.
now your life and your soul is leaking out of your knife wounds on the floor, and you're going to tell me you're sorry now. It was a very angering thing, right?
Right.
And so uh you know I went out and basically I told everybody, as like, his friends were like really freaking out, like they wanted to kill me, but they also didn't come near me, right?
Right.
Because obviously at this point I mean business, and I've demonstrated that. So
Yeah.
if you want some of this, there's more of it. You just come on over here and get it. Is If not, I'm going to walk out that door and wait for the police to come. And so that's what I did. And the people parted like the Red Sea, and I went straight out the door and I sat there till the cops came, and they took me to jail. Obviously, I got charged with attempted aggravated murder, and I was facing 25 years at 18 years old. So I go through a little bit, about a year of court proceedings and things like that, and then end up um, scraping together with my family like $8,000, and paid an attorney to strike a deal, and took a plea bargain,
Okay.
which is another thing I talk about in the book. That
Yes, you do.
over 95% of all cases end in plea bargains, right? So um, it's a very, like, they throw the entire kitchen sink at you because they want you to take the faucet, right? And so that's what you're going to do almost every time, because you don't have $50,000 for a jury trial.
Right.
So I took the deal, and I got a 2 to 5 in prison, and I did the whole 5. So I did the complete 5 years. So at age 19 years old, 135-pound kid, I entered the adult penitentiary system and spent 5 years there.
So when you were in prison, you said in the book that I read books voraciously on every subject, from religion and philosophy to politics and psychology. And at some point, I realized that I had reached the end of the glorification of my own violence. So, Varg, how did you reach that conclusion when statistically you were signed, sealed, and delivered into violent criminal activity for what was, you know, what would have been the rest of your life? But somehow um, you come to this epiphany. How did, what sparked that moment uh, to reject the lifestyle that you were living and the glorification of violence?
Honestly, I just think that I had always been wired to be a family type of person, and wanted that as a kid. Like, I wanted a normal father, and I wanted to do the things that I seen other families doing. And I always wanted that.
Okay.
So I think that stuck with me really hard. And when I went to prison, the first couple years of prison, I was pretty out of control, and you got to be. I mean, you have to become, you either try to disappear and become invisible, which very few people can pull off well, or you become savage, or you become a victim, right? And you have very few choices about what role you're going to play in there.
Right.
So I became pretty savage, and I started, that's when I discovered very hardcore weight training. I was very fortunate to enter the prison system during the glory days, we'll call it, like where there still were free weights and weight piles outside, and like it was still like a like classic traditional penitentiary like you would picture it.
Right.
As I understand it today, that's changed a lot, but it used to be where you'd go in and there were like these gigantic, scary looking, jacked guys on the weight pile just staring at you like they were going to eat you. And, that was the atmosphere. And so I joined that atmosphere, and I was trained to reach that level, physically and mentally. And it was a very fortunate thing because it introduced me to programming and studying and researching and working hard for something, and then getting the reward and reaching goals. Just like I said, we read books on every subject. Like one of the things that we did was would have every book from like Weeder's, Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding Principles, and Arnold Schwarzenegger's biography. Like
Right.
Super Squats was a big one back then, right? Like, and so we'd have all these books, and then just every month you just try to get books and read as much as you could, and learned about periodization, learned about you know just everything about that subject,
Hmm.
and that led to getting big and savage and strong and being kind of scary myself. And then that gave me the space to think, where I didn't have to be so on guard all the time. So I had the space to think at that point. And then when I started thinking, I was like, um this right here doesn't go far. This is where this ends, like, because you either end up dead or in prison, and that's where all the tough guys, that's where all the real tough guys are.
Hmm.
All the real badasses are either dead or in prison. And you know and I say that saying, meaning that is at some point in time you stop, and you change your life. You go, and I don't care if you were like a special operations soldier and you did some super badass stuff over there. Eventually you stop doing that stuff and you become a businessman or a father or a husband, or but you can't do all of it forever, because it only ends in a couple of different ways.
Right.
And so that's what I came to the realization of, that I had done everything. I had conquered everything. I had experienced everything. I had nearly killed someone. I'd been, stabbed myself a couple of times prior to prison. I'd been involved in, situations where there were shootings, and there were, just extremely violent things, and I had experienced all of it. So there was no reason to continue to do it. I just reached a point where I was like, this this is old now, and
Mm.
it's time to stop. And that was it. So I thought that I wanted to have a family. I wanted to be a family guy, and create the family I never had. And so that's what I tried to do when I left prison.
Yeah. So, an amazing turnaround from where you were headed. And it's such a stark contrast between, say, your first 25 years and then the second half of your life, because you end up devoting yourself to teaching citizens and local law enforcement fight training, fight conditioning, gunfighting, violence education. So I'll quote you from the book. I have been fortunate enough to train with some of the best gunfighters in the world. I have trained under and worked for national level SWAT trainers, U.S. Special Forces veterans, Russian Spetsnaz, and many more. My work in the defense industry has granted me access to closed law enforcement training like breaching, executive protection, and shoot house courses for law enforcement and military only. I hold certifications to teach SWAT level full team close quarters combat, and have been approached to train at tactical officers training events. How, so how and why did you end up taking that path? So I understand the epiphany comes, you realize that this is a dead end. You want to be a family man one day, you want to have your own family, you want to have a different life. But it's interesting that yet you still stay in this area that you've been immersed in, just, now you're wearing a white hat, not a black hat any longer, right? So tell us why you decided to go from being a wolf to someone who trains others to fight wolves.
Because no matter how much you try, you cannot deny your nature. And if you do, if you try to, it's going to make you sick. And it, I believe, made me sick. After a while of me, I spent a lot of my life when I got out of prison. You feel dirty. You feel like you have this big red F on your forehead that everyone can see. And even though it's irrational, you feel like a dirty person. That's because they make you feel like less than everything. And you can be denied, I don't know how many times I was denied jobs, denied places to rent. Like, it is completely 100% legal to discriminate against a felon in every possible way in this country. It is legal and often encouraged to do so. And so things that they could never get away with doing to a black person or an Indian person, or someone because of their sexual preference or something, they can totally get away with doing it to a felon. And so they make you feel terrible anyway. And so I spent a
Mm.
lot of years hiding who I was. And for many years, I would work with people or work in jobs or do things where people would know me for several years and never knew I had been to prison, never knew I was a felon, never knew anything about my past. And I essentially was living incognito for years. And I was living someone else's life, basically. And in the background, I'm still running this little bit of this other side of me. I'm going to boxing gyms. I'm going to fight gyms. I'm in the gym still, and around like about 5 years after I'm out, I started to kind of get back and be like, okay, so I'm going to bring a little bit of it back. So I became a personal trainer and started working in the gyms. And then before you know it, I was full time in the gym life and fight gyms and, weight training and things like that. And that kind of gave me some expression of it. But it wasn't until I had went through a couple of, couple of bad marriages and things like that, and I went through a couple of things personally in my life where I was like, you know, I have to just own my story. And so in 2016, I decided, I'm like, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to break the story and I'm going to tell the whole freaking world who I am, because I'm tired of hiding and I'm tired of people being like, I would go to work at a job and then I would be always afraid that somebody was going to find out about me and then wield that over my head in some kind of power. And so I
Right.
took everyone's power away and I took control of my story. And I told the entire world my story. This is who I am. I'm a felon. I'm a violent person. I've been an extremely violent person. And this is what I know about these things. And so with that, the training world opened up even more to me. And I was very fortunate to get pulled in by some law enforcement organizations that saw the value in what I knew and wanted to train me up on their side to understand their mission and their problems better. And so then I got pulled into the industry. I went to work for at the time, one of the big industry players in terms of equipment and gear manufacturers.
Okay.
And through that sent me to work, and now I was getting paid to go to police level training for product development and things like that. And so I was accepted into, for example, breaching school, mechanical, thermal, and ballistic breaching school is like a week long where they send officers to go and learn how to breach. So you're breaching everything to breach a building, a fence, a perimeter, whatever you need to do to get inside of a structure or a place, all the things that you need to do: tactics, defense, offense, and equipment, right?
Right.
And so that and shoot house training. And then I went through the full multiple different places too, but I went through the full spectrum of, CQB work and high risk, high risk warrant entries and dealing with those type of problems. I was able to the go on training missions with teams, and several different teams. I've worked with guys from, Metro Nashville SWAT, which is a full-time SWAT team. And then, guys from other departments where they're like borrowed part-time SWAT team guys. Like, so I got to see all the differences and how the different teams work, who's really good, who's not. and understanding these things from the other side of it too, because I'd been essentially on the other side of the wall, right? So I could see it from the guy who might be in the room's perspective, because there were many times growing up
Hmm.
that you know, houses were getting raided and stuff like that. It was something that you were aware of and you knew about, right? And there were things like, you know, um hit like my family growing up had a hidden grow room in the basement, and it was hidden through a false paneling wall that was off of a wall that didn't have any windows in the basement. So depth perception would be very difficult from being inside to outside, because there's no visual cues knowing
Right.
you're missing 4 feet of room here, you know? So knowing stuff like that, I'm able to go into those situations and see kind of what's going on the other side of it. To give me a really unique perspective. But I really just was looking to round out my own knowledge so that when I was able to teach, I could teach from a more a well-rounded, more knowledgeable perspective all around. Like, not just from a criminal side of it, and not just from a guy who's, you know, was a cop for 10 years and he's teaching that, because there's always huge gaps in that information.
Hmm.
And I was just really seeking to find ways to bridge the gaps or fill the gaps that I seen in the things being taught, because they're, you know, in the late 2000s, when I started to get into the tactical and the gun training and things like that, that industry, there was really not a lot of great stuff being taught. Like, there was a lot of really, you know, hokey things being taught, and there were some groups of people and some people that were getting YouTube famous and stuff that really shouldn't have been.
Mm.
They didn't have the, you know, they weren't bringing like real experience to things. And so it was good because it created this like groundswell of people that wanted to be involved and wanted to shoot guns well and stuff. So that's cool. But there was just this huge misinformation, not just gaps, but misinformation, and the whole attitudes, and, you know, the sheepdogging and all of the different things that were going on. And I was just like, you know, I know things that are counter to what you're teaching here. So I'm just going to come out. And I told people from day one, you know, I'm not coming into this industry because I really want to be in it. I'm not coming in it because I want to be a famous instructor or anything. And my time here is limited. I'm not going to stay here for long. Like, I want to go do other things.
Mm.
So I'm going to come and like drop some knowledge in this thing for a little bit. And then one of these days I'm going to be gone and you guys are going to be on your own. Right. And I'm kind of in that direction now. Like, this year, I haven't even scheduled any classes this year yet. So, and I don't know if I will,
Interesting.
because I'm busy with other projects. But that was kind of the impetus of it for me, is that, you know, I had to take control of my own story, and I couldn't deny my own nature and hide who I was anymore. And so I just took ownership of all of it. And that's when, you know, I catapulted out to the front of everything. And then that's, you know, everything changed at that point in my life, got a lot better, actually.
That's really interesting how counterintuitively, you took the power back, you took the narrative back, and everything turned out actually better for you for doing so, both with opportunity, both and with that feeling that you had inside of just living, having to live incognito and not being able to express who you truly were. Um, it's a really interesting lesson. You could swap stories with people. The lesson holds true for whatever it is that you're experiencing when you're living a lie. So let's get into um, self-defense, civilian self-defense, because you know uh, so many people take self-defense courses, and again, your book is just a complete eye opener as to probably the waste of time that most of it is. I've taken self defense courses throughout my life. And as you rightly say in the book, most of that is martial arts training, right? Um, but also those that are interested in learning how to shoot properly. Um, one of the big things you start off discussing in the book is having a mission when it comes to training for self-defense. So I'll quote you from the book. The very first step in any training is to identify the mission you will train for. What is your mission? I always ask this question first thing for every level course I teach. It is amazing how often people cannot clearly answer that question. So can you elaborate on this idea of every self-defense class or course I ever took, never even thought about that. Was never asked it, never thought about it. Nor I would say 95% of anyone going for self-defense classes. So can you explain this idea about having a mission and why that's so important?
Yes. So your mission dictates your equipment, it dictates your gear, it dictates your preparations. Your mission will detail your parameters, your boundaries, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. Like that's really what that's for, right? And if you are operating without that, you get this big opportunity to make huge mistakes. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, a lot of people would come to me and say that their mission was to protect their families and themselves, and just keep them and their families safe, right? And I'd say, and then I would present an opportunity to get into a fight. In theory, say you walk in and a guy's holding the clerk at gunpoint, or and then they're like, well, I'm going to jump into that, and it's like, listen, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, and I'm not judging you for either being willing to jump into somebody else's fight and not being willing. What I'm saying is that you need to have that clearly delineated in your mission statement beforehand, right? So if you're willing to get into a fight and risk your own life and risk your own future for someone you don't know, don't say that your only mission statement is to protect yourself and your family, because that's not true. And then you're not preparing properly for the real mission that you're actually willing to do. So I'm saying, like, just be honest. And I tell people like this, like, if you told me you want to be Batman, that's hey, I'm all for it if you're being honest with yourself, right? And you tell your family when you leave every day, you say, I might not come back because I might die protecting someone else. If you're cool with that and they're cool with that and you're honest with yourself about it, then you've got your mission statement clearly put out. But if you are thinking one thing and willing to or go into another thing physically, then that's different than what you're thinking. Then you have not properly prepared your mission statement, and your training is not based on that. And beyond that, the problem with training that doesn't cover mission is that mission it's made up of boundaries and parameters. And you have to understand where you need to stay within in order to stay within the mission, right? You can't go outside of that and expect to accomplish the mission. So if your mission is to be there for your kids when they graduate college, or walk your daughter down the aisle or whatever, if you go outside of the guardrails of that and go and jump into a fight that you know nothing about, and you don't know who the actors are, you don't know what's going on there, and you risk your life and you get killed, you failed your mission of being there, right? So, and I'm not judging you was good or bad, like whatever. I'm just saying you simply failed the mission that you stated you had. So the training that you have that you take needs to have your mission built into the training. That's why there's a difference between military and law enforcement and civilian level of training. Like, take for example a very simple thing like law enforcement can pursue a violent felon. They can even engage a fleeing violent felon if they deem it's necessary. You as a civilian don't have those same opportunities. Like, you're not allowed to pursue and engage someone who's fleeing from you in most states. Like, in most states, the laws state that if they have ceased the attack, you cannot continue to issue deadly violence in that instance, right? So if you understand that, but yet you go and train to shoot people running away in the back, right? It sounds ridiculous, but let's just say, for example, right? Like your training now does not line up with the parameters of your mission. So you're training to do things that are not within your mission, that might be within a law enforcement officer's mission, but not yours, right? So we have to be very clear what we're training. The training has to be built by the very criteria that the mission is based on. And that's how I feel about it. And that's why I emphasize that, to keep people out of trouble. And also too, it's a self-control issue beyond that. Like, and I give examples in the
Well,
book of people that,
yeah, I want to get into that. That's
okay.
really important, that concept you just mentioned, self-control. But I want to hold off on that for a second. Because you talk about, first of all, again, what you just said makes so much sense when you hear it now, right? That, oh my God, of course I should understand this. But I've never heard anyone say it before reading your book. And, you talk about, a lot of people romanticize this idea of you want to learn self-defense, and, you want to learn how to shoot, and you want to be licensed to carry a gun or concealed weapon, so that if something happens, yeah, you want to protect your family, but you're also ready to jump in at a moment's notice to save someone else, or to be what you call a sheepdog. So you talk about Batman here, right? In your book, you talk about the perils of the sheepdog trap. And I'll quote you here. You say, that whole sheepdog movement is something I personally have come to detest in the training and concealed carry world. It's bullshit, especially when adopted by civilians. So I'm familiar with this concept, but for our audience that might not be, first of all, what is a sheepdog, the so-called sheepdog movement, and why is it why do you see it as a problem?
I think that well, first of all, the sheepdog analogy is really like, it comes from the whole wolf and sheepdog thing. And, you know, now for context too, this book was written 3 to 4 years ago, and the problem isn't as bad as it was back then. I think it was
Okay.
way worse back then. So some people may read this book now or in the future and be like, what's he talking about? That's not really, well, when I wrote the book, it was
Yeah.
a problem, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it still is to some extent, but the sheepdog thing is the analogy where the sheepdog is the protector of the flock, and the sheep are, dumb sheep that aren't going to protect themselves. And the sheepdog is the courageous, protector that steps up to the plate and protects them. And the problem with it was that it became this t-shirt slogan type of motto that was very easy to print on a t-shirt, or put it on your mission statement, and then you could just be this courageous, like you were in the courageous club now, right? You're a member
Right.
of the protector class, right? And whether you see yourself that way or not, to think of it in terms of, now I'm a sheepdog, it starts to create a little bit, a few problems in terms of developing mission, because you have to understand that, if there's a law enforcement officer, like I just talked about, a few minutes ago, there's very differences in what they're allowed to do or what they're obligated to do than what you're allowed to do and what you're obligated to do, right? And we start to blur those lines when we start to have these like cliche analogies and these cool mottos and statements. Like, it starts to blur the lines of real logical critical thinking. And so whenever we have something that's cool and like, it's like I said, a t-shirt type logo motto type of thing, it's easy to adopt that and not do any critical thinking about what really is my role, and
Right.
what am I really allowed to do, and what am I really obligated to do. And so I would meet so many people that were like screaming sheepdog, but had no idea what the laws of lethal force engagement were in their state, that had no idea what their capabilities were on a range. Like, could they get a gun out from concealment and put a shot on target at 7 yards in a second and a half or less? Like, they had no idea what their real capabilities were. They had no idea what the real limitations of the law and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So there was no critical thought put into it, but there was a lot of rah put into the whole sheepdog thing.
Right.
And so that's where we run into the problems. When you have things like that, it's easy to just put you in. To be honest with you, if you go back and listen to the early the early adopters of the sheepdog thing that pushed it really hard, their earliest talks and lectures were always to law enforcement only, and they typically had a negative, they really had a negative view of people, of civilians carrying guns, because they weren't the professionals, right?
Right.
It's just very evident in their early talks. Like if you go and listen to these, these individuals, and then later, once they maybe realized how much money they could make by letting civilians join the cool club too, now now it's okay. Now the civilians are protectors too, so
Right.
so the whole thing was just brought on by a marketing thing that I really didn't think was very, it was very ethical. But honestly, it's the blurring of the critical thinking. And that's where my main problem is. And that
Gotcha.
you're not putting it in because you're just adopting some analogy and some, t-shirt level motto that's like there's no thought put into that, right?
Yeah. Gotcha. Gotcha. So, okay. Um, Quote you here. Whether or not you are highly trained, you say that avoidance and escape are objectives number one and two when it comes to confrontation, but that sometimes the fight is just unavoidable. You say you have no chance to practice avoidance. You're left with no avenue of escape. You must fight. And in that instance, your objective is to win. But Varg, your definition of winning a fight is completely different from everyone else's, right? In the book, you describe, right, the categories that you see as being crucial to actually winning a fight. And again, this is what no one is really contemplating when they're out there, whether they're sheepdogging or not, whether you're taking a martial arts class, or whether you're really good and have spent years practicing in whatever type of self-defense that you've been studying. The reality is that you're just thinking about the fight and winning it, but it's actually so much more. Can you explain for everyone what is critical when it comes to truly winning a violent conflict?
Yes, of course. There's not just the physical fight. There's the legal part of it. There's the psychological aftermath part of it. There's the social part of it. There's the financial part of it. Like you've got these different after effects that a fight can, incredibly impact your life and change your life forever. And I say that having been someone who made the mistakes, who didn't have a clear mission statement, that thought, that I was automatically the good guy all the time, and, paid the price. My life was ruined in a very real way. And I feel the effects of that to this day, right?
Mhm.
20, it was, you said earlier, 17 years. It's actually 27 years ago. Um,
Okay.
27 years later, I'm still feeling the effects of this, real effects, not imagined, like real tangible things in my life are being roadblocked. Last year, I was roadblocked from having any COVID relief because of the criminal history.
Wow.
And up to this year, I am still barred from becoming a USAW certified coach for USA weightlifting because of felony status from 27 years ago. And I have an athlete that's going to nationals in 2 weeks, and
Wow.
she's ranked probably third or fourth in the nation right now, and I can't be a sanctioned coach in that. And I have someone that's actually at the top of the pile, getting ready to go to worlds, right? So my life is getting very impacted by this to this day. So when I talk about this stuff, this isn't just something I dream up, right? Like this is me saying, listen, if you make these mistakes, right, you will pay dearly. And it doesn't mean like train hard and you'll win the fight. Like there's the legal part of it, which I suffered immensely. There's the social part of it where you can get ostracized, Like if you get into a fight and you kill someone,
Yeah.
people change the way that they deal with you. Like you're not the same anymore, right? And people are very uncomfortable with people that kill people. Like it's shocking, maybe, yeah, right? Like they they just don't like to be around people that have taken someone's life, and you can lose your job. Your job can have to cut you loose because being attached to you would be a problem at that point, right?
Right. That's
Um,
right.
there's so, especially today in cancel culture, like if you kill the wrong person, or what somebody perceives as the wrong person for the wrong reason, even if you win the legal fight, it will cancel your life out.
That's right.
And
That's
there are
right.
people right now that are in legal battles right now that have gotten involved in some of the political things that went on, and shot and killed someone, and their lives, their families' lives, their mothers, their fathers, all in hiding, and their lives are just completely turned up down. They've lost their jobs and everything. They lost their livelihood because the social impact, not just the legal, but the social impact will take your entire life away from you. And then on top of all of that, you've got to deal with yourself in your own mind, the psychological part, and I don't care how queued up you are, when you deal with taking human life or deal with like extreme level violence like that, it can really affect your mind in ways that you are not able to predict right now. You might think you can, you might think you're okay, and I can tell you from experience, again, from experience that, for me, I had very combative sleep disorder problems, like, where I would wake up and feel like I was being attacked, and I would be in these tremendous fights, and I would tear up parts of my house before I would even wake up. And
Mm.
this went on for several years after being released from prison, and I still have to this day very mild episodes of it where I'll wake up, thinking somebody's coming, and I'll apparently stare at the door or something, or like get ready to do battle, and there's nothing going on. It's all in my dreams. And this is all after effects of like extreme violence, like being involved in hostile environments and extreme violent situations where I'm okay walking around during the day and I don't feel bad about what I did. I don't feel bad about the guy that I stabbed. Like, I'm okay with what's happened personally on a conscious level, but
Hmm.
unconsciously, these things will find a back door into your mind, and that could be in your sleep. It could be through your family relationships. Like there's so many different ways it can attack you psychologically, and PTSD is a very real thing. And
Oh yeah.
and you have to understand too, like especially if you get convicted, but even if you don't get convicted, if you're a combat veteran, you come back, there's like Wounded Warriors and Heart Foundation and all these places and all these groups and all these things that people are like really ready to help you. And, there's no such thing like that for convicts. And there's no such thing like that for, you know, just average people who have been through a violent confrontation. Like people are not going to understand you, and you're not going to have a support group that's going to be there to pick you up. You're on your own. You're on your own. And when you have to deal with this psychologically, or the fear, like, so I know some people have a violent engagement or they kill someone, and then they can't even sleep without drugs for years after that because they're scared to
Right.
death to go to sleep, right? Like there's very real impactful things that happen to your life when you get into, and just because you're a tough guy and you think you're ready, I can promise you that there are ways it can still get to you, you know. And so you have to think about all of those things before you're ready to engage.
Yeah, it's again, like I said, eye opener stuff because no one really is considering these things. They're quick to act. They're feeling good. They've got the rah rah. But even if you can win the physical fight, as you mentioned, the social, the psychological, the legal, these are whole nother level battles that you could lose and lose everything on. And that's when you get into why it's so important to understand avoidance and escape as really your first
Yes.
two very powerful options. And I'm going to quote you here. So you say, but why should we have to cower to bullies and arrogant, rude people? Um, and you say how this concept, you say, if this is how you're thinking, and you look, and you might be right? When you say, look, why should I have to cower to bullies and arrogant, rude people? Why should you? Especially if you're trained properly.
Mhm.
But you say, if this is how you're thinking, then you are very likely headed for a great loss. There is a fine line between taking action in situations where you feel like if you don't act, you're a coward, and true self-defense.
Mhm.
You know, Varg, this is a tremendously important distinction. And you're the first one to say that people have the absolute right to defend themselves with deadly force from violent attack. And you're even the guy who trains them to be good at it. But I'll quote you here, and this is really interesting. You say, nice people fall to the manipulator. The manipulator crumbles under the assertive. The assertive shrinks before the aggressive, and the aggressive have no plan for the assaultive. The assaultive are unprepared for the homicidal. So you bring up this quote, which I
That's
think you attributed that to someone else actually.
Mark McYoung. Yes, that's his quote.
That's right, Mark McYoung. Um, can you explain this? Why is this another thing? Forget about the other issues like the legal fight, the psychological trauma, all of it. But what that quote? Why is it important to consider this when we're talking avoidance as opposed to engage?
It's very. We can point to a very recent event, and I think we all know about the snow shovel murders, right? Where the
Yep.
couple got murdered a couple weeks ago, just a couple weeks ago,
Yeah.
and it was right in their street in the front of their house. Now that happened, and it's amazing the surveillance video we get these days. I mean,
Yeah.
we
It
got
really is.
audio and everything. We got the whole picture. We got the whole story right there from start to finish, you know? And so the the husband and wife are out there,
It's
and you can
crazy.
clearly hear the husband saying, "You're a pussy, screw you, you ain't gonna do anything." Like, he's calling this guy terrible names. He's telling him he's not gonna do anything. He's basically calling this guy a coward and a punk and everything else. And so what he's doing in that moment is he's being assertive and even a little verbally assaultive, right?
Hmm.
He's not prepared for the guy that just goes straight from okay to homicidal.
That's right.
And that's what happened, right? So we think sometimes, especially when we're like tough guys, right? We think, oh, I'm just going to tell this guy what business is, and he's going to, that's going to shut him up. What if that guy stabs you in your face? Yeah, like, now you have to fight to the death, right? You have to kill this guy, and all you wanted to do was just tell this guy, put him in his place, and you weren't prepared to go homicidal. You thought you were just going to be assertive, maybe assaultive, maybe punch the guy in the mouth, and we'll have a good old fashioned punch fight, right? But this guy pulls out a knife or a gun, and now it's a whole different deal because you weren't prepared for that, because you thought that, oh, nobody's going to pull a knife or a gun. We're just going to, I'm just going to punk this guy out. And this is what happened. This guy's standing at the end of his driveway. He's yelling these obscenities at this guy. And this guy's like, all right, I've had enough of your shit. And he comes down and shoots them both in the head very clearly.
Yeah.
And he tells him, when he shoots him, he tells the guy, he's shooting the guy the second time with the gun. And he comes back with a second gun and he says, oh, I'm a pussy, huh? Huh? Boom, 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 boom. Right? He tells the woman, you should have kept your mouth shut. Boom, shoots her right in the head. Very calmly, right? And then he goes in the house and shoots himself because he realized that he snapped and he went over the edge and his life's over now, right?
Yep.
But that's exactly what we're talking about when we say things like that. Like, you open the door, you don't get to pick who comes through. You think you can predict it, but you don't know who's coming through that door when you open it. And if you judged wrong, you're going to be dealing with something more than you're prepared to be dealing with.
Yeah. And this is really why the mindset aspect of self-defense is way more important as a consideration than the physical stuff. And again, it's why your book and what you're doing is so refreshing, because it takes a completely different approach. You say, quote, mindset is ultimately the reason that you got into the business of teaching self-defense and violence education. Weapons and fighting skills only make up 20% of a fighter's capability. The other 80% is determined by what takes place in the mind. So, can you talk about what? So, let's talk about the mind in this. Let's talk about violence of mind. What makes up the factors of one's mindset that will play a critical role when you find yourself in a violent conflict?
So I developed this idea based on my own experiences. And then as I was studying and researching, I came across Colonel John Boyd, Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd. And
Right.
of course, he's most known for the UDA, but all that really interests me out of that whole body of work that he produced was the orientation part of UDA. And
Okay.
he honestly felt like that was he called it the Schwerpunkt, right? The center, the most important component. This is where everything else emanates from. And he worked with Chuck Spinney and Chet Richards very closely. And I recently have been in contact with Chet Richards, and I'm finishing up my second book right now. It's Orientation. It's just on orientation, just completely on the mindset part of it. And
Okay.
so I was in contact with Chet Richards, and I sent him my manuscript. And he, of course, worked directly with Boyd. He was one of Boyd's best friends, worked with Boyd many, many years, and was developing some of these concepts with Boyd. And so for me to take my interpretations and send it to someone like Chet, I was a little bit nervous. I'm like, wonder what's gonna. But he sent back the most amazing, statements, and he was like, "This is fantastic." He's like, "You've really captured what Boyd was trying to work on, and you really grasped it." And the stuff that me and him and wrote and Chuck Spinney have written about, you're really doing great stuff with this. And then he like even shared a couple of private letters from Boyd to him, and some
Wow.
quotes from the yeah. So I got really lucky to be able to do that. And so that first part of the second book that's coming out is that whole section that he had some input on, and he really put his stamp of approval on it. And it's basically this, we have experience, we've got culture, we have value system, we have genetics, we've got parameters, internal and external. Like all of these things create our decision making processes. They color and guide our decision making processes, right? How you feel about violence is largely guided by your experience, your culture, the culture you were raised in, what you were taught about violence, your value system, how you value human life. Like all of that guides your basically your decision making and subsequently your actions in a violent confrontation or in any decision making process you be in. So understanding how a violent mindset or the ability to commit violence and deal with violence really well on both counts is basically how your orientation is put together. And so I talk about this in the book about if you're dealing like people have said erroneously in the past that human beings were not wired to hurt each other and and soldiers would fire over the heads of other soldiers and things. And I say it's erroneous because the data is not complete. First of all, there's no data. There's no the US military is not in possession of any research data that's documented anywhere that says these things, right?
Interesting.
This was opinion that was based on, some interviews that someone said they did. However, there are other people who have subsequently went on to do interviews and have documented lots of data, but you're also talking to people who are like military and law enforcement and been engagements and things like that. The prerequisite to be in military and law enforcement is to be law abiding, not be in trouble and like all this. So you're not talking to killers, right? So there's a problem with your data in the first place. So if you go on and talk, because I would read this and I'd be like, man, I don't how have they never met any real killers? Because I've known like several, I've
Mm-hmm.
known many, many people that were just straight up killers and they are in prison for it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm wondering where's this coming from? Why is there such a, a disconnect here in this information? And I think it was because you're interviewing people who come from an orientation where their culture and their values are against violence and against doing bad things to other people, and they're taught these things. They come from that better part of, the world or better part of society. Whereas when you're dealing with someone who, like me, for example, I grew up immersed in violence, and it was not only was a way to gain glorification or, praise and power or authority, but it was also a means to get what you wanted, or to, to dominate your space, right?
Right.
So my culture and my values are very different. By the time I'm 18 and I'm 19 and I'm landing in prison, my value system is very different. Like, evaluation of human life is very selective, right? I can put you in there anywhere I choose to, right? You can be highly valuable, or you can be as valuable as a dog, right?
Mm-hmm.
So reaching that point by the time of you're a teenage kid is a very different thing than taking some like high performing good kid from school. He was on the all-star wrestling team, and he's, now he's in the military, and he's a great soldier, and he's, he follows every order and he does everything right. Then you send him over there to kill people. And, so now he's got a, a shock in his orientation, because now he's been thrown into a world where it's very different in terms of selection of the valuation of human life, and how culturally, how they view death and how they view murder and things like that.
That's
So
right.
now he's thrust into it very quickly. Same thing with a cop. He's, grows up pretty good life, not, not anything real shocking. Then he's thrown into like a patrol situation where he, is thrown into a violent world where, the valuation of human life is very different than what he's used to. It's culturally very different for him. And that's where PTSD really kicks in, because there's like a rapid change in orientation, right? Like you go through an event that like rapidly changes who you are and how you feel about things, and you don't know. Then you come back from that world, you come back from, Afghanistan or Iraq, or you come back from prison, or you come back from, and now you're trying to reintegrate, and that's where the problems start to manifest, because you can't go back home now because you're not the same person,
Right.
and so there's a big issue there. And when we're dealing with orientation, you have to understand, like, okay, like someone who's grown up in, say, some of these neighborhoods in Chicago that have these incredibly high murder rates, right?
Right.
You can find somebody in those neighborhoods that's been in 4, 5, 6 gunfights, that's been shot 7, 8, 11. I know guys that were shot 11, 12 times, that walk with a limp. And like, these guys are like, you listen to hip hop stuff, these guys live the real life. Like, that's the lyrics aren't just lyrics to them.
Mm-hmm.
They live that life. They've got shot, they've shot other people, their homies have been killed. Like, they've got people that are, and so the problem is, that that is built into a culture over time and from a young age. So culturally, you're acclimated, and your value system is based on that culture. And now you have a very different way of seeing things. So your ability to commit violence from that atmosphere, from that world, from that culture is much easier, much more highly developed, right? And then you take someone else who has to like rapidly acclimate to that, then they're going to have a little more of a psychological rift that they're going to have to reconcile. And some people can reconcile it okay,
All right.
some people can't, you know. And so the orientation is your values, your culture, and your genetics play into it too. There's some things you don't have control over. Like, there's some things that you just are who you are, based inherently on how the chromosomes all came together for you, right? Like, and so there's all these factors that go in. And when you make a decision, that's what drives mindset, because mindset is just basically a perception of the world and yourself and where you fit in that world. And so when you have that mindset, the stories you tell yourself about who you are, how you fit into the world around you, how the people around you fit into that world, everybody's telling themselves a story, and that's where the orientation really comes in at.
So, this is so important for someone who would find themselves in a violent conflict that happened very quickly, and they're facing someone who is whose culture and values are such that it allows them to make a very quick decision about murdering you, because everything that you've just described, from an individual that's come from a culture where they're immersed in it, the decision making process, the OODA loop is quick, right? And they're going to react or act whilst the average person who hasn't been through anything like that, taking the self-defense course, who, even though they have the tactical training, is for the first time in their lives thrust into a violent confrontation. All these things are going to be going on. You're suggesting the psychological gears are going to be turning that might prevent them from doing what you did in that fight when you were a kid. You stabbed the guy 2 dozen plus times. Um, Someone else might not have that decision making capability to go that far and do those things and lose their life very quickly because the decision took too long for them to get over the realization that they have to take a life in order to survive. How in God's name do you solve this? So number one, right? I'm assuming the first most important thing is to understand what's at play, what's at stake, as you call it, orientation. Understanding that is maybe half the battle. But then, okay, I understand that now, right? I've read your book, you've explained it now, so I understand that. How does the average person then fix the fact that they don't have 20 years growing up in a neighborhood where where it's kill or be killed? How do I fix that so when the moment comes I can react properly?
Well, first of all, that's exactly what the second book's about. So,
What is the okay? What's this second book called? Do you have a title for it yet?
the working title is orientation, but we'll see what it ends up being. But
Okay.
it's going to be orientation, something about orientation in the title.
Okay.
The title is actually getting a very serious SEO research part to it, so it's going to be a very thought out title for
Okay.
the purposes of being found.
Okay.
But the answer to that is, and I go into that in detail there, but there's initiation, there's the stories that we tell ourselves. There's, the things that operate inward, the things that operate outward. The things that operate inward are, their experiences, the stories we tell ourselves, who we are. And I explain to people when I see things like, in the gangster culture, there's this like archetypal template that is applied very powerfully of like the gangster. You go into a dope house and there's like Tony Montana on the wall, and he's like the archetypal gangster that just takes everything. He's got all the women and he's, he just has people killed. And like that's kind of the aspiration, like the high level, the
Right.
archetypal template that drives that psyche. And it's very powerful, right? And there's like a whole glorification of this like high level ex-con gangster type thing, and people are like, that's disgusting and stuff. But then I'll see those same people like have Spartans tattooed on them, and everything they do is Spartan and Viking, and warrior this and warrior that, and Spartan this and Spartan helmets on your ARs and Punisher skulls on your Glocks. And I'm like, listen, you're doing the same thing. You guys are doing the same. You're playing the same archetypal template game, and you're pumping your psyche up with a story. He's pumping it up with his story. You're pumping it up with your story. You're building your story off of these, these crutches and these props that you use. And this is human nature. We all do it.
Right.
We're all telling ourselves a story about who we are. And it's, you either have a growth mindset or you don't. And if you have a growth mindset, hopefully you're telling yourself a story about you're trying to be better all the time. But you can get into these traps, even if you're doing that, where you're like, you're glorifying these templates that you become very cliche with. And you're doing the same thing as the bag. Like, and everybody's on this thing, like, they're not like you. That really, you're all the same. You just, at the end of the day, you make different choices based on different cultural values, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're going through the same decision making processes. You're battling the same thing with uncertainty. You're dealing with the same issues of creating, bolstering and shoring up your orientation with, story and archetypes and experiences, and trying to gain everything you can to back up the story of who you think you are, who you want to be.
Right.
And so that's what you're doing. And so the answer lies within that, is to, it doesn't take, it's not a very short process to change culture, but you can change culture, right? You
Okay.
can reprogram culture. And I see it happen all the time, because it's very clear when you watch guys who are, all-star students in school and very mild mannered. They go to the military. 16 years later, they've done 11 years in special forces. Now they come back a completely different animal,
That's right.
completely different culture, right? They've been reculturalized, right?
Okay.
Same thing with prison. You'll see the same thing happen there. Or same thing with cops. You meet a cop brand new, he's like kind of green and he's a little nervous and scared. You see him 13 years later, he's an asshole, right? He's a
Right.
different guy. Like, you know, and so and not all of them end up that way, but that's just an example, like, of he's reculturalized, right? So the orientation, the initiation experience, and you talk about someone that gets into that fast, unexpected engagement. The problem is if that was their very first exposure, then that reculturalization is going to happen like all at once, and that's a very traumatic psychological event for most
Gotcha.
people. And if you have it happen like over time, especially if it begins at a young age, it's not as traumatic, and it's normalized, because it's a very slow, gradual process, and it's repetitive, and it's all you ever knew. Whereas if you knew something completely different, and you lived in a world where people didn't try to kill each other and things like that, just here in my area, last night they found a girl on the side of the road that had been grabbed off of the road at 9 o'clock in the morning, off
Right.
of Main Street, knocked out, took her out in the woods and raped her and dumped her on the side of the road. Now that girl's world just changed. She's not going to live with the same preconceptions about people that she had yesterday, right? And it's going to be very traumatic for her. And I hope that the people that were responsible for that die an incredibly painful death, right? And my evaluation of their life is obviously selective, right? So culturally, how are we looking at that? Do we really value human life, or do you selectively value human life, right? And so you start to get into these questions about, that guy that did that is worse than a diseased dog, right? To me, he's worth nothing, right? And if you ask average people, the simple question, do you value human life? If their immediate response is yes, you may have a problem someday. You know,
Right.
if your response is, well, it depends, then maybe you're on the right track, right? Culturally and value system wise, like, because if you have to make that decision to take somebody's life someday, if you are on that old way of thinking where violence is kind of a bad thing, and all human life is valuable and things like that, this guy doesn't think your life is valuable. So what are you going to do? Now there's the possibility, and people bring up this all the time, and it's very valid, that untrained little old ladies defend themselves all the time with a little revolver, right?
Right.
And it's true, it happens. And there's no explanation for why one person, will react, one untrained, unexperienced person will react a certain way, and another untrained, inexperienced person will react a complete opposite way. Like, there's no predictor that's going to tell us. Like, you can't look at the way they were raised and say, oh, that's why. Because there's people that, grow up in completely loving, great homes that turn into serial killers, so
Mm-hmm.
there's some kind of genetic thing going on there. There's some kind of other thing going on that science can't really explain at this point. So when you think about people who are like panic protecting themselves, and are successfully panic in a situation, or successfully just react in a situation with no training and just defend themselves. And there's times where people will come out of that okay and be like, yeah, that was scary. Whoa, man. Glad that, that guy didn't kill me. And they're like, fine. And then there's other people that will panic and protect themselves, and then they'll be complete wreck, and they have to go to counseling, and they get, and their relationships fall apart, and they just have all these problems, these lasting effects. And so the only thing that we can do to combat that and try to set ourselves up to not experience those negative effects is to begin to try to culturalize ourselves and understand selective evaluation of human life, and understand that sometimes we have to do things. Sometimes violence is the only thing that solves a problem. And that's just the truth. And the more violent a situation is, the more likely violence is the only thing that will solve it. If you have an incredibly violent person that attacks you in a parking lot someday, I don't care how good of a speaker and how articulate you are and how compassionate you are, you're probably not going to talk that guy down, right? The only thing that's going to stop him is somebody's going to put a hole in him that puts his clock off, right? Other than that, he's going to go.
Mm.
And so when you realize stuff like that and you begin to, acclimate yourself to understanding that there are people in the world that are just terrible, just like the girl that got raped yesterday. Like that person that did that is an absolute animal. And I have daughters and things like that, right? Like and we all have people that we care about that would be victimized by someone like that. If
Right.
you don't realize that someone's like that is in your neighborhood like that. This happened just not too far from my house, right? They're in your neighborhood. They're in your city. They're in your town. They might be on your street. They're there, and if you don't realize that these people are there, then you can't really start to think about having to face that person someday. And you can't really start to build that orientation, that acceptance, and reculturalize yourself to include violence in your culture now, right? Because a lot of us were raised without violence in our culture. Like not me, but a lot of people, that
That's
I've
right.
come to realize it's just not in your culture. And so if it's a part of your culture, that's a good beginning. If you're going to BJJ and you're doing all the stuff, that's a great beginning. But just realize that don't tell yourself these stories, like go too far down that rabbit hole, and then you have this good guy syndrome where you're not really thinking out what's really going on. You just think that no matter what happens, you're going to be the good guy and that's all it's going to go. You're going to be the hero. Like that's not how violence typically plays out. So you
Right.
need to think about it more deeply than that and be ready for all of those ramifications and all of those complications that happen from it. And that's why I pushed that part of it really heavily, because everybody else is about how fast can you shoot, how much, how many submissions can you pull off, like, how much can you deadlift. And I'm over here like, listen, the most deadly people I found in my life that I've come across probably couldn't deadlift much, and they probably didn't train much, but they were extremely dangerous people. And they were dangerous because their mind was acclimated to thinking the in the ways of a predator. And if you're not acclimated to thinking in the ways of the predator and understanding how a predator, you cannot be an effective counter predator, which is what you must be. That
Right.
makes sense.
Completely. Completely. You say in the book, so here's a quote, a couple of things um, that we'll get out of this. First is you say, and this is when it comes to the concept of attachments. Okay. Attachments. That's a piece that you discuss in the book as being crucial to, the elements we're talking about, culture, values, parameters, right? Boundaries, attachments. Quote, what are you willing to kill or die for? The parameters of the mission are set by your attachments in life. How far are you willing to go to protect them? As a kid in a violent home and upbringing, and as a young man in prison, I had very few attachments. I did not feel that same sense of clinging to family that average people fear. I actually hated my life as a kid and had the attitude that I didn't ask to be born into this fucking world, so why should I give a fuck? This made me extremely dangerous. It lowered my fear greatly to sometimes imperceptible levels. It is how I came out on top in some of the deadly and dangerous situations I was involved in. Retrospectively, however, the greatest effect it had was that it took the focus off of me and my inner world and put it directly on my opponent. You need to know this about your enemy. When you are toiling away in your own mind, worried about things that pertain to you, you are taking energy and focus away from your enemy. When you fought me as a kid or a young man, you were fighting someone who absolutely did not give a fuck about anything except hurting you, even if I die trying. So you set up this duality of the power of attachments, both the power of having an attachment that you're willing to die for. If you understand, truly, what are you willing to do to protect those that you're attached to, versus the power of not having any attachments.
Mhm.
So what I'm curious about is what is more. So can you elaborate on this point, but also get into your thoughts on what is more powerful, or how do you ride that, that fine line, between having attachments or having none. You mentioned the most powerful example of understanding and controlling attachments can be learned from Buddha, right? The founder of Buddhism. So there's this whole mindset thing going on in one's head around, I have attachments. I can draw great power from ensuring I'll do whatever it takes to protect them, versus I have no attachments. I'm free to no longer worry about what has to be done. There's a lot there. Can you kind of dive into that topic?
Yeah, and this is what I'll say. I think to narrow it, to summarize it, I
Okay.
would probably put it like this: attachments are what's going to really drive you in your training. It's what's going to drive your mission. It's what dictates your mission for the biggest part of it, right? Like, what are you willing to kill or die for? What are you training for? What are you willing to step into extreme violence for your own life, for your own protection? You're attached to your own life. You're attached to your health, your well-being. You're attached to your wife, your kids, your family. These attachments you have in life are what you most likely are willing to kill or die for. So it's what drives your training. Is what drives your instinct and your intuition development towards being a self-defense. Being developed in self-defense. However, up until the moment that you're in the fight, when you get into the fight, if you're sitting there thinking, as bullets or blades or anything is coming at you that can damage you, that can kill you, if at that moment you're thinking about, oh man, am I never going to see my kids again, or what's going to happen if this guy kills me? If you're thinking about your attachments, you're focused inward. You're not focused outward on your opponent, and you're not going to win that fight. It's very unlikely that you're going to do well in a fight when you're not focused on your opponent, because your energy and your focus is inward, and you cannot win or do well or be effective when your focus is inward in a conflict. You have to be focused outward and dealing with what's coming at you, synthesizing new information as it's coming in, synthesizing it with the information that you already have, making new conclusions based on what's happening in front of you. Like, all of these things, all of these processes have to take place, and they can't take place if they're disrupted by you being focused on, oh, I'm going to lose my life. I'm going to lose my family. I'm not going to see my daughters anymore. Now, sometimes that's what drives people. There's stories of, I heard a story from, Masada Ayub, talked about a cop opened a closet door, a guy shoots him in the face with a 357. And all he could think about was that he wanted to get home to see his daughter. So he killed the guy, right? He fought through it and he killed the guy. So at that moment, those attachments drove that guy, right?
Right.
But he was, if you think about it, he wasn't focused inward. He focused that outwards. Like, he's like, I want to get home and see my daughter, and you're in my way.
Right.
So that's the difference, right? So you have to either be able to compartmentalize attachments in the heat of the moment and put them where they need to be so that you can do the job, the task at hand, or you let them drive you, but you don't allow it to take your focus away from doing the job at hand. And that's the big difference. So you have to think about it professionally and say, I have a job to do. It's quite simple. I need to do this job. And if you're motivated by other things to do the job, that's fine. But the focus has to be outward on the job. Stay focused on the task, stay focused on the job, do the job, get it done. Then you deal with the attachments and all those things. That you open up that steel case, that metal box that I tell people you lock that up in when you get ready to go to the fight. Do your job, do your work, do the things you're trained to do what you know you're supposed to do. Then you deal with that stuff afterwards, right? Because that allows you to stay focused outward and stay focused on the threat, stay focused on the job at hand. And I think that makes a lot of sense thinking about it that way.
It really does. I think that's a great explanation. for what we must consider psychologically. But it also then relates to that whole issue about if that is truly what's driving you, your attachments, if it's driving you properly, then you also have to understand that that should be what drives you to stay out of the fight if you can, right? And avoid or escape as opposed to head into the conflict. Because if your attachments are that important to you, then unless your life is on the line through no fault of your own, then do what it takes to avoid being in that situation. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct. And we'll go back to the snow shovel murders, right? Like those people obviously didn't take the threat seriously enough to understand that they were jeopardizing their attachments by engaging in that verbal conflict, right? They allowed they allowed their anger and their emotions to push them out of the realm of self-control and into becoming verbally abusive, because they obviously
Right.
didn't think that really was a threat to their attachments, but it was, because now they're done. It's game over completely for them. Their attachments are all gone, right?
Yeah, and this is again, why I say your book is such an eye opener, because these are the things we should consider, but we're not. Even myself, right? An aggressive testosterone filled individual. And I might not be thinking about these things, right? Quick to get into an argument, but you're not really considering these other elements. Now that guy was God rest his soul. He was being an idiot, right? Bullying the other individual, humiliating the other individual. Wasn't, but you're just not considering these things. Even if you get into an argument where you're not doing that, you're just getting into a superheated argument, and it can get out of control very quickly. But you're not psychologically the orientation isn't there.
No.
The orientation. I love this whole concept of the orientation. It is so important, because and putting your mission in perspective. Um, Again, opened my eyes to the degree that I truly understand the concept now, of avoidance, escape. These are absolutely the keys. And now, I want to get into one final topic, because here's the crazy thing. I have another 3 hours worth of questions for you.
Absolutely.
There's so much, right? But you've been very generous with your time, Varg, and we're coming up on the end here. And you mentioned something at the beginning that I found, that I kind of stopped you from talking about, because I kind of wanted to wrap with this. I want to talk about self-control,
Mm.
because that's what we're kind of now talking about, really, is having that self-control. So I'll quote you here. Self-control must be practiced outside of violence and training for it to be real in your life and your skill sets. From the samurai to the knighthood, politeness, character, self-control, loyalty have been standards in warrior code of conduct for thousands of years, for good reasons. It has long been considered the pinnacle of warriorhood, to be able to set down the implements and language of war and attend social events displaying impeccable behavior and hospitality. This became the mark of success in both the personal and professional lives of warriors in nearly every civilized culture. It also allowed the fighter to fit into whatever environment he found himself in, the ability to operate across classes effectively. You question, what does this have to do with violence in today's world? Everything. Can you please explain, um, why it has everything to do, that concept of self-control and what I've just described there, your quote from the book, why it is everything when considering violence in today's world?
Yeah, self-control it's the only factor that really determines how successful you are with any of the things that you try to do. And what I mean by that is that things can go right, things can go wrong, unexpected things can happen. Like there's so many variables in life, period. Like that, not just in a conflict, but in life in general, that if you don't have control of yourself, everything's going to knock you off of your equilibrium. Just the slightest thing happens and you're angry or you're upset or you're sad, or you just don't have any control over yourself or your emotions or your thoughts anymore. That's the extreme, right? But there's ways to lose control without being just a complete, out of control person. And I always, back when I wrote the book and I started writing some of this stuff probably 10 years ago,
Okay.
there were really aggressive people who were marketing the whole like always ready to fight. That's your job. And it's just like you can be totally ready to fight and completely out of control. And that's not good, right? Like being ready to
Right.
fight is not the whole story. Being ready to fight, being in control. And I always talked about combat mindset being one of self-control under all conditions. That's really the combat mindset that we're trying to achieve. That no matters what is coming at you, you have control over your emotions. And one of the things that I talk about in classes, I'll get I'll get students of wide variety of backgrounds and experience, and some of them are very tuned up and been shooting a long time, going to a lot of classes. They really feel like they're prepared. And I'll ask a question to the class and I'll say, let's say you're in a public space. It could be a mall, restaurant, a concert, whatever. You're out with your family. You've got your kids with you. The people you care about are with you. You're holding your child's hand. Your wife is on your side. Your kids on the other side, and an active shooter begins in that space. And the first shot hits your child in the chest, and you feel his hand slip away as he slips to the pavement. Now you still have two, three other family members there that need your protection. Where's your state of mind right now? Are you still in the game, or have you been completely taken out of the game at this point? Now, this is an extreme example,
Right.
but it's a very real example. And it's one that parallels to like you've got special operations units or military. If they make entry into a room and the first guy that goes through the room gets painted across the wall, the guy behind him has to go step up and take the job. If he doesn't, then the rest of the team is going to be in danger, right? And that guy that just watched his friend get painted across the wall knows that guy's wife. He knows that the joy that he had just having his baby last year. He's been to his holiday events. That's his best friend. That's his brother. He knows all of his intimate family attachments and things. He can't deal with that right now. He's got to do the job because he has other people depending on him behind him in that doorway. If he doesn't get through the door, get to the position, get the team in the room, and dominate the room, there will be a problem for the team and more people will get hurt. So it's the same thing. If you're out with your family and one of your family takes one of the first shots, are you now just sitting ducks, or are you able to get to work and try to, terminate that threat, neutralize that threat, and then take care of what you can fix, right? And that's a self-control issue. That's an extreme example, but these are very real, real considerations, right? And if you could, nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's perfect, and I lose control and I have bad days, and but when you lose control, you open yourself up. And I'll give you a very good example. I just got into a road rage incident. Florida's extremely full of road rage, and the traffic is just unbelievable here. And I had somebody behind me at a red light, or a stop sign rather, and he just flipping out. He's screaming at me because I'm not moving fast enough for him. Well, I got two trucks in front of me. I can't possibly go anywhere. But this guy's having a really bad day. He's about to snap. And he starts off with me. And I'm not having a great day. So first I'm like just trying to ignore him. And finally he's like right up on my bumper and he's screaming and he's raving his hand out. So I roll my window down and I'm like, go around me, motherfucker, if you don't like it, right? And so now I've incited him more, right? So
Right.
now I turn the corner, and this is how violence works. This is why you don't get a say sometimes, right? Because I wouldn't have got it. All my preparation in the world wouldn't have saved me that day if he would have decided to do what he could have done. And here's why. I turn the corner. I get caught on the right side of the road between two trucks. I can't move. He runs up and blocks me on my left side. So now he's on my driver's side. He pulls up and I see him like now. I'll tell you, I had my window already down and I did prep my weapon. I already drew my weapon and I was prepared that if this guy was going to pull up and blast on me, we were going to engage in a gun battle at that point. And so I'm already prepped. I already have my weapon in my hands under the line of sight of my door. And I'm prepared if this guy goes off, if he goes off the reservation, we're going to go together. Right. So he rolls up and I look over and I see his hand raise up towards me inside the car. But guess what happens next?
What?
The sun is glaring on the window just right that I cannot PID his hand. I can't see his hand.
Oh.
The sun completely blocked my view of his hand. So now I'm stuck. If this guy shoots, his window's going to shatter, bullets are going to come my way, and I'm probably going to take hits. I can't because I don't know what he's got in his hand.
Right.
So, and we're riding like this for like, it seems like a long time. It's not long in reality, but it seems like a really long time because I'm like, shit, I'm stuck. Like, I'm not going to shoot because I can't justify it. So there we go with like parameters and mission and all this self-control stuff. Like I'm at a deficit. I'm in a disadvantaged position. This guy's 3 feet from my vehicle and he's pointing right at me behind a window and I can't see his hand because the sun glare is blocking my view completely. So then he waves down or he rolls down the window and it's his middle finger. And I'm like, man, guy, you're super lucky. I have a lot of self-control. You just have no idea. Like,
right.
But how unlucky was I that just that perfect angle of the window, the perfect position of the sun,
right.
All the factors came together that I was ready. I was prepared. I know how to shoot. I know how to shoot from that position. I'd done all the training. I had all the equipment. I had everything. And guess what? None of it meant anything because violence sometimes doesn't give you a choice.
Yeah, it doesn't. And then how interesting is it that in the end, your mantra of self-control saved his life and more importantly, saved the rest of yours.
Mm-hmm.
So just, a very powerful example of what we've been talking about. Varg, it's been an amazing conversation. I can't wait till the book comes out. The book on orientation. We got to have you back on for that. I can ask a bunch of other questions here and get into the new book as well. Where can our audience learn more about what you're up to, what you're doing? Where can they find you?
Right now, my biggest projects are obviously I'm writing the new book. I just put the audiobook out for the first book, produced it, recorded it, did it all myself. And that's done. So I'm writing the new book. So writing that is probably my primary project right now. My biggest work that I'm doing in training is my strength and conditioning project that I have, Cognitionist Training Systems. So it's ctsmethod.com. And I have a lot of really awesome clients across the country where I'm remote training barbell and strength. And there's literally 27 years of experience in there that goes into that. So it's a lot of fun. I enjoyed a lot. I think it's the foundation of where anybody should be, because even if you go and learn, martial arts or self-defense, if you don't have the chassis to deliver those things and actually stay in the game, none of it's going to mean anything. So the biggest thing you could do for your own life is get in the gym, get strong, and do it properly in a safe way that's going to have longevity built into it. So that's where you'll find me for that. In general, vargfreeborn.com is my main website. So links to my fitness and my gun training and stuff is there. I haven't put any weapons training classes up yet for 2021, and I'm considering that I might put some up. I will be with A Girl and a Gun this year. I'm volunteering some time for them, and I'm volunteering some time for Ohio Tactical Officers Association again. But outside of that, I haven't put up any classes. So keep an eye on the websites. Maybe I'll put some up. but I am scaling back on that a little bit so I can focus on these other projects.
That's great. That's great. I urge everyone to, at minimum, get your book, Violence of Mind. It is a deep, deep look into the psychology and the circumstances and the experiences firsthand, your own, of violence and how to truly understand what it takes to live in this world, survive in this world, uh, in a in a powerful and meaningful, uh, and ultimately a a way that keeps you alive with integrity and allows you uh, to be there for the ones that you love, and consider all of the issues that go along with what you might face one day if you're not prepared for it. Varg, thank you so much for the work that you do, uh, and uh, and for what's to come. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right, you have a good night.
You too. Thanks.